Hey guys, so I just finished watching the interview with Thomas Massie and Theo, and I was kind of surprised by how similar the interviews were. I was expecting there to be a little bit more variety between the topics that they talked about and the answers that were given. However, I do like that there was consistency among the stories that Thomas Massie told, so at least from that aspect we know that he is consistent. I do have to point out that I'm slightly convinced that this is a completely different person. Like, I don't know him well enough again to be able to tell that that's still him with the beard, but he just looks really different to me. And watching this interview and the one with Tucker, even his body language is very different. And so that's just really surprising to me. And when I was watching that first interview, I did not realize that shortly after that first interview with Tucker, I think it was June 7th, 2024, but I don't know when they actually filmed it. Shortly after that interview aired, his wife had passed away, and so I thought it was more recent, and so now I'm having that information that I was missing, and so I was wondering if that would come up in this interview with Theo and how they would kind of approach that topic. So it was good to learn a little bit more about him and then also see how he has handled this tragedy and unexpected event happening with his wife passing. This is Hey Brittany. Welcome back. Okay, so Theo, his humor is a hit or miss for me. I don't know if he's trolling when he reads his ads, if he's like playing into this character or this bit. I know that from watching this interview and some of the interview with Candace, he is really trying to get his funnies in, and I don't understand everything that he's referencing, so that makes it not as funny to me, but he definitely is a comedian. He's definitely trying to get a reaction out of you, and so you could see moments where Thomas Matthew is like genuinely laughing and then just kind of laughing to be polite and stuff like that. So yeah, his humor is just a hit or a miss for me. However, with the way he talks, his accent, he does remind me of Tim Riggins from Friday Night Lights for some reason. He doesn't look anything like him. I guess they kind of do have long hair. I think Theo has more of like a mullet than whatever Tim Riggins had. So he just reminds me of him, or he makes me think of Tim Riggins. So anyway, in this interview, they talked about how Thomas Massie lives off the grid. So they covered that in the Tucker Carlson interview. And I actually didn't know that he was living in his car in a camper. And I didn't even know that they made these mini campers that he's using. So it's basically on the back of his pickup truck. And it just looks like a really tiny, small space. And so he told this story of how he, I guess, got in trouble because he was sleeping in his car in a parking lot, and he was talking about how cops and somebody else was sleeping next to him, and then they found out that he plugged his camper up or whatever into this extension cord or this electrical outlet, and so everything was fine as long as he didn't invoke KOA or Campgrounds of America. So I guess it's basically where people just sleep in places where they're not supposed to. As long as he wasn't doing anything like that, it wasn't going to be a big deal. And so that was something that I did not know from the first interview, because I know that he was talking about how he would go back and forth between where he lived and then also in Washington, but I really just assumed that he was staying in a hotel. I didn't know that he was committed to this off-the-grid life even while he was away from home. Moving on to the topic of national debt, he did give Theo his national debt pin, his debt badge, which I thought was kind of interesting. Like, I don't know if he would actually walk around with that, but it is cool to have one of Thomas Massie's inventions just from hearing all of the different things that he's talked about creating. Like, he talked about creating like a motorized pen for his chickens, and it moves and all of that stuff, and so that was really cool just to see how much Thomas Massie has invented. And it's like, yes, you're good in Congress, but you should also be out there inventing stuff for like the general population. And so it's just fascinating when you have someone who is so smart and they take the time to figure these things out and they just create this stuff as a hobby. And so that was probably more fascinating to me, hearing about all of these different things that he's created when he's trying to solve and fix problems. Now, in relation to the national debt, he was talking about how we basically not necessarily doing like a Ponzi scheme, but we're basically borrowing money or taking money from the future, from future generations to take care of now. And he was basically saying that this is a problem because we aren't really conserving or being mindful of our spending. We're just throwing money at different problems and really not thinking about what's going to happen in the future. In the future, we will have to deal with all of these decisions that we are making now. And I didn't talk about this in the other interview. This was something that I had left out by an accident. And he was basically talking about how other countries absorb or take on our debt. And then he was also talking about how we buy other countries' assets. And so this came up again. And so he was basically talking about how other countries buy our debt and they want to do so at a certain interest rate. So I think that means they make more money off of the debt that they are taking from us. I'm not 100% sure. But he was also saying that this is tied into how interest rates are set. It's not as easy to lower the interest rates just because of all of this asset buying that is going on between America and other countries. So I didn't fully understand the whole conversation on how that works and how another country can buy our debt. So that is something that I want to look more into. So I was glad that he brought that up in this interview. And in terms of national debt and money, I do just want to go back to him living off the grid. One thing that he pointed out that was very interesting to hear was that he was saying that he didn't think that he saved any money by living this off the grid lifestyle, which I thought was unexpected to hear because you assume that most people, they live this off the grid lifestyle because they are trying to save money, they're trying to cut costs, and then to find out that you have to pay a lot of money up front in order to set everything up. But hopefully by the end of everything being set up, it balances out. So I just wasn't expecting him to say that he's not really saving money. It's just a more environmental way to live, but in terms of cost, it's not really that different. So if you have a choice between living off the grid and paying the same amount of money or living your normal life and paying the same amount of money, which option are you going to choose? Most people are going to choose the route that is easier, more convenient, which is to leave everything the way that it is instead of having to go through the headache of setting everything up so that you can live this off the grid lifestyle. Now, moving on to the big, beautiful bill, Massie talked about how people, the American people, were okay with spending money because we don't realize that we're the ones paying for it. And so he was talking about how with the one big, beautiful bill, it has all of this stuff in there about the budget. And basically, they were saying that maybe in 10 years, the deficit will balance itself out or it will lower the deficit. But he was saying that in 5 years, the deficit will actually increase. And then I guess by 10 years, it will kind of fix itself out or balance itself out. And so the point of this conversation or this topic was how he was talking about the impact of passing big bills and having everything shoved into an omnibus bill that makes it really difficult to figure out what our politicians are actually voting on when everything is all together in one huge big bill. So this led them to the topic of Mike Johnson and also omnibus bills. And so he was talking about how he really does not like that Mike Johnson is even passing or putting on the floor even one bill of a Democrat, basically saying that because they have the majority, they should be really pushing and focusing on Republican proposed bills and all of that stuff. And so he's just saying that he's not doing what's right for the Republican Party. He is just doing his own thing and he sees a huge problem with that. And so Theo was kind of pushing back on this because he was saying, well, you know, he's working with both parties. Basically, why does it really matter which party gets the credit for whatever, as long as this is good for the party or this is good for the American people? And so Thomas Massie was kind of pushing back on that in a sense, and he was saying that it's more honorable or it's more admirable to have your party's views and stick to them versus shifting around and moving around. And so I kind of get where he's coming from in terms of that frustration with Mike Johnson and the party he's supposed to represent. I do agree with what Theo is saying as far as the two parties being able to work together to create bills and laws that are going to benefit the American people. Now, in relation to having an omnibus or having one big bill that includes a whole bunch of different topics, they were really talking about how this makes it difficult to figure out what your candidate or your political representative is actually for. So if you have 5 different topics in there and they're voting no because of one topic, then you can spin the narrative, oh, well, your candidate is against these 4 topics and he's not fighting for you and all of this stuff. And so he was really Thomas Massie was really advocating for the fact that everything should kind of be presented as a singular issue so that you can actually know what your candidates and senators and representatives are voting on, because it's just that one specific issue. And so he was talking about how if he presented a bill and then it got added into a larger bill, obviously he wants his bill to go through, so he may be more likely to approve that bill, even if there's other things that he doesn't necessarily agree with, because he wants his bill to get passed through. And I do agree that makes it difficult, because they were talking about how some bills can be so huge that you can't read through everything to figure out what it actually says, and you just pass that through without really knowing the implications of what you guys are approving. And so they gave this example of I think it was in the One Big Beautiful bill, and it was talking about AI. And so he was saying that states or whatever cannot monitor or have oversight on how AI is functioning and all of that stuff. And then he was saying that it included something about zoning laws. So what that meant is that they could put a data bank in your backyard just because of what they put in the bill about zoning laws and zoning regulations. And so just having everything shoved together in one bill makes it really difficult to understand, one, everything that is being passed, and then also understand what your representatives and senators are actually disagreeing on or agreeing on. I did think it was funny that Thomas Massie brought up the speech and debate clause, and so he was basically saying, hey, I could lie while I'm doing my job and I won't get in trouble. And so they read the definition of the speech and debate clause, and this is basically that while you're doing your job, like while you are on the floor of Congress, of the chambers and all of that stuff, you can argue your point and you won't be penalized in a legal way for what you say, because if you fear saying something and being punished for it, then you're less likely to do your job. And so I think that makes sense, but I just thought it was funny that he said, oh, well, I can lie, because if you wouldn't want people to think that, oh, well, what has he been lying about? You know what I mean? So I thought it was funny that he framed it in that way, but I do understand what he is saying about the purpose of the speech and debate clause. Now, on the topic of lobbying, we had the same stuff that they talked about in the Tucker interview, to where Israel is the only one who has a lobby as far as other countries. He was really hitting home that other countries don't lobby in this way. And then he also talked about how getting involved in other wars, getting involved with other countries and their drama, this just makes those other countries hate America, especially if we're doing crazy stuff. And so again, he was basically saying that he didn't really want to speak on what we get out of being in a relationship with Israel. He was basically saying that whatever we get from Israel is not worth it to have people hate us and to do all of these different things that we don't necessarily agree with. So that was something that he didn't want to dig too much into, but he did make a clear stance to say, hey, whatever we get from them is not worth whatever the cost is going to be. And on another topic, they talked about people with dual citizenship, and I know that this has come up a lot too, with how we have people who are in politics and they're from other countries and they are wanting to use American resources basically to improve things back in their home country. And so this came up as well in this interview, and Massie was saying that he proposed a bill to say, hey, you have to disclose if you have dual citizenship in another country so that we can know what your position are or what your stance is and all of that stuff, because there does need to be some transparency, because he was saying, every country basically has a constitution, so you can't stand by or adhere to two different constitutions. You're going to have to pick one or the other. And if you have a dual citizenship with America and another country, you should have to disclose that so that we know how you are being influenced. Now, in terms of war, Massie reiterated what he said in the Tucker interview, which is basically that we spend a certain dollar amount every year on the military-industrial complex, which has been renamed the Defense Industrial Base. And so he's basically saying that we spend about $50 billion a year to kind of keep our defense industrial base strong and ready to work and all of that stuff. And so we know that Thomas Massie doesn't support sending money to foreign countries. And then he also doesn't think it's good that we have been giving Ukraine as much financial support as we've been giving them. And he also tied this back to Speaker Johnson, where Speaker Johnson was the tie-breaking vote in whether or not we would send more aid and support to Ukraine. And so he's just really talking about how we are unnecessarily, I guess, involving ourselves in foreign wars that in turn make other countries hate us. And he was also talking about in terms of nuclear weapons, this can be there was a term that he used, I can't think of it. It was a weapons of mass destruction. And I think he said weapons of mass distraction. So basically saying there's this argument that a country has nuclear weapons. And then he pointed out that there's other countries that also have nuclear weapons, but we don't really focus on those countries. We don't really talk about them or consider them a threat. And so he was just basically saying this whole weapons of mass destruction argument is really just a distraction to make us buy into this narrative that we have to react a certain way when that's not necessarily the case. Moving on, he also talked about Trump, and I really like that he told a different story while also imitating Trump. And so let's watch this video of him talking about his interaction with Trump. He was explaining that Trump gave him a call when his wife passed away, and he didn't, I guess, take the call because he was getting so many calls, and then he was going to endorse Donald Trump for president, and he was listening to the voice message that he left, and he gave President Trump a call.
That's a hard one. That's a very hard one. You know, Arnold Palmer, he played around a lot, but he did love his wife. And when she passed away, it almost killed Arnie. I mean, it was tough on Arnie, but he's a tough cookie. You're a tough cookie, too. And, you're like Arnie. You'll get through this. And then he goes, I take it back. You're much tougher than Arnie ever was.
Okay, so that was a really funny moment. One, I really like the way that Thomas Massie is imitating Trump. Like, he does it in a way where he makes President Trump's voice sound hollow. I guess that's just the way it sounds to me, but it actually really does sound like him. And so I really just thought it was funny that he's able to impersonate him so well. And this is the second time that I've seen him do that. And then also, Theo is interesting here because he just keeps ad-libbing while Thomas Massie is telling this story. And at times, he was just kind of adding stuff to the conversation that was kind of unexpected. And so I just thought it was funny that he was just chiming in during parts of him telling the story to kind of add stuff that either you didn't necessarily need to say or whatever. And so it just made this moment even funnier because he's trying to follow along and then kind of contribute to the conversation. Anyway, I thought it was a little bit maybe concerning that he brought up, I think the name was Arnie, and he was saying, oh, he stepped out on his wife or whatever and blah, 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 but he was really devastated, blah, blah, blah. And so I would have personally been offended if you're comparing me to someone cheating on their wife and then having to deal with the loss of said wife. And so I was surprised that he didn't really kind of say anything about that, because that is kind of like a weird comment to make, especially if you're not cheating on your wife. And so anyway, that was how I took that comment that he was sharing. But overall, I did find the interaction funny, especially with the way he was saying MIT instead of MIT. And I'm not talking about anybody else's speech patterns or anything like that, but I did think that he did a really good job of impersonating Trump and kind of embodying his essence in a sense to where, yeah, that really sounds like Trump. And so not everyone can impersonate people so well to where they just nail it. And so I really love seeing moments like that. So just going back to the Tucker interview, Massie mentioned that he basically interfered with whatever Trump was trying to do like 8 different times, and he was making the joke that Trump didn't realize that it was the same guy each time. And so they basically have had this like back and forth beef, and so there's something recent that has happened, and I think it was connected to the Iran war. And so he is telling this conversation that he had with Trump where he was saying like, hey, he doesn't think that Trump wants to have war with Iran, but he's kind of using it as a way to threaten wars to get a deal made that doesn't lead to war. And so Massie was saying, well, this strategy is not going to work because they could call your bluff and then you actually have to go to war, and then he wasn't going to be able to vote on it. And I didn't understand why he wouldn't be able to vote on it, because I think he was giving him the vote to say, yes, you can declare war or whatever, even if you're just pretending that you're going to declare war, and then when you actually go to war, we don't have a say on it, is what I think he means. But that was a little bit difficult for me to follow and for me to be able to accurately recap that section for you. And so he's just talking about his relationship with Trump where they butt heads every couple of years. And so it was just nice to hear him talk about a recent example, since the interview with Tucker Carlson was from a year ago and I didn't have the full picture of their relationship. And then he was even telling a story about how he is endorsing Trump. He was supposed to go speak in Wisconsin to endorsed President Trump. He called him back. And then the other part of that conversation was that they worked out like, hey, just post something on Twitter. And then he hands the phone to this guy and says, hey, this is Thomas Massie. He's a tough cookie. Don't screw it up. And so it was just funny that he's one showing respect for Thomas Massie, but then he's also like, he really wants this to go through. And then he was also talking about a line that they added into the tweet. And I don't know the guy's name, but this is basically somebody who was in prison for selling stuff or having a dark website, and they got jail time, and one of Trump's things was that he was going to get this guy out of prison, and so they worked that into the endorsement speech. The other thing that I really liked was him talking about TDS, Trump derangement syndrome, and he was talking about there's two variations of it. There's one where you hate Trump so much that even when he does things that you want, you're just against him doing it because it's him doing it. And then there's the other hand where you like him so much that you change your principles when he's doing things that you don't agree with. And so he tries to stay in that middle. And I think that is super difficult to be in the middle, because he was talking about how, just going back to the two parties, everything is really set up for Democrats and Republicans. So if you're an independent, you don't even have your own area to go to, because everything is really just set up for a two-party system. And so he really is in the middle of trying to balance, one, what the Republicans want, and not necessarily working for the Democrats, but he's more towards the middle on some things, I feel like. And that makes him more of an independent. Also, he was just basically talking about how he can like Trump or whatever, but still kind of say like, no, this is the line and this is actually not going to work out well, and kind of oppose what Trump is wanting to do. The other topic that they talked about was virtual reality and more, and this connects to Massie's background as far as like his inventions and his company that he had. And so they played this ad that was basically advertising war, and they were just talking about how much it looked like a video game. Theo Vaughn brought up this question that I hadn't even thought about, and he was basically saying you can have a point where people sign up for like a streaming service and they can watch literal war, which is really crazy, because for the longest time, we've just been hearing about war from what other people have said. We have not been able to visually see it happening. And so the idea that you could sign up for some service and you could see war as it's happening in real time is pretty crazy. And lastly, they talked about voting. Theo Vaughn was really talking about how it feels like it's the voter against the politician. It feels like game over. There's nothing that we can do. And so Thomas Massie reiterated that as a voter, what you do at the local level matters. And he was saying that you should get in touch with three people: your two U.S. senators, your House of Representative person. And so he was really just saying to focus on contacting the people that you have a direct say in voting them into their positions, because they are more likely to listen to you, because if you are their constituent, they have to prioritize what you say and what other people in their district say. Otherwise, they could easily not be in that position if they do not get the votes that they need. And he also talked about calling your representatives versus emailing them or sending a letter. He said that it makes a difference when you speak to someone on the phone. And he also talked about how he speaks to the people who answer the phones every day. And so he is really hearing what people are saying. And so I do think that that is reassuring to hear that these people in Congress want to know what their people are saying, what people care about, and giving us a avenue or a way to contact them so that our voices can be heard. Alrighty, so that wraps up my series on Thomas Massie. I really just wanted to focus on these two different interviews so I could learn a little bit more about who Thomas Massie is in his own words, and also what he believes in and what his stances are on different issues. I'm not sure what direction I'm going to go in as far as my next interview that I want to watch and review. I have been looking at Jasmine Crockett because I have been doing a lot of Republicans and all of that stuff, and so I do want to have a fair balance of what I'm looking at and who I'm learning from. So my next interview that I cover may be on Jasmine Crockett. So if you have any recommendations, let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.